Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Module 2 of our Intro to Criminal Justice course. I want to take a moment before I get into some of the content of my video here tonight to apologize for not getting these two videos up on Monday as I originally intended and said that I would. If you have been watching them, I applaud you. Thank you for doing it. Again, I apologize. I just have not been able to get myself to get these videos together. It's been a little bit crazy here this week, but no excuses. It definitely won't happen again. So if you did watch that first video that I posted going over the information on exam 1, please, again, if there was anything that confused you even further about what I was kind of talking about the difference between the 4th and the 14th Amendments and those perspectives on justice, please feel free to reach out to me. One of the hardest things about this online format is that we don't have the opportunity to really discuss some of the minutia of the course, some of the things that may not be part of the overarching idea and plan for you to get to this course. We're not always going to remember all the specific dates and the specific terms, but they are important, and I do want to make sure that you guys get those and you understand those. So please feel free to reach out. To those of you who have reached out, thank you again. I really appreciate it. I'm here to help you guys and facilitate you guys getting the most out of this course and being able to take the information forward and do with it whatever you're pursuing. So yeah, a little bit on chapter 4 and 5. So I know that you all have already posted your chapter 4 discussion boards. Great job. Again, real quick, if you have any concerns about your grading on the discussion boards, number 1, definitely refer to the rubric, and number 2, reach out to me and we can talk about it and I can explain, or maybe even give you some more points. Who knows? Communication is key, though. That's the way that we can get the most out of being here. But chapter 4. Chapter 4 is what kind of opens up this module. Obviously, it does open up this module, specifically looking at the history, the foundations, and the origins of policing as we know it today. So very briefly, policing grew from this communal sense of accountability towards those who wronged another person in some way or some form. A big thing to kind of remember about this is as you're going through these chapters, definitely focus in on the terms. Since our exams are objective, we're going to be looking a lot at terms, not as much about dates, though dates are important. The bigger thing is definitely make sure you understand and know the terms that are being presented in the material. And there are a lot of them in those first few pages of chapter 4 that we're looking back at the origins of policing in England. So again, policing grew from this idea of this, communal sense of accountability. And as the population grew, a more formal system was developed to aid the watch system that was in place in the 13th century. Later in 1326, a justice of the peace was created to assist shire reeves, or sheriffs as we know them today, to perform judicial and some administrative functions, building, the first link, creating that first link of the relationship that we see today between policing and the judiciary. Public policing, though, as we really know it, did not come about until the early 1800s through the Metropolitan Police Act from Sir Robert Peel in 1829. This act was basically a response to the corrupt private police force that had bloomed through the 18th century, which in itself came from a rising crime as the population continued to grow and people were kind of getting more closely packed in together. American police in a similar form grew the way that the English police did. American police initially were primarily reactive agents. They weren't proactive crime fighters. And due to their structure, due to the way that they kind of naturally formed in a similar fashion to the way that police were formed in England, that kind of structure bred some informality that was rife in itself with corruption and other issues, very similarly, again, to what they were facing in England before, and somewhat during, but mostly before the first real public police force was created. But the first real formal police agencies that we see, the ones that are closest to what we see and understand of police today in modern society, were established in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, obviously on this side of the ocean. These major cities were seeing a rise in mob violence in the early to mid 1800s, and there was an increased need to overcome the kind of informal police functions or police structure that had taken over, that again was rife with its own corruption and its own issues. So police in this area kind of assumed roles that were very, very similar to what we understood of the Watchmen back in England before more, slightly more formalized police agencies and police structures grew, not functions, excuse me. These agencies were focused really on order maintenance, again, rather than crime control, and public perceptions were still overwhelmingly negative about the police. They felt that police were still corrupt, that they were incompetent, even with it being a highly desirable position, because of the fact that people were paid well to become a part of these first, quote unquote, truly formalized police agencies. There was no true standardization, and there wasn't any training. So these policemen just kind of, were put on the force and just kind of went about their business otherwise, and tried to catch people and tried to be reactive to situations as they arose. After the Civil War, though, that's when agencies really began to focus, more on crime. Real reform began in the late 1800s and early 1900s, as state legislatures, removed control of police away from local government and into the hands of the state. The reason for this is because, crime rates were still continuing to rise, and obviously what they were doing wasn't working. They weren't able to address any of the issues that they were seeing. They were just these reactive agents. So throughout that time, reforms began to take place, standards began to be set, and you start to actually see the structure that we see in policing today. By the 1960s, the Supreme Court started handing down decisions to actually control the police with the issues that they were still seeing, even within the standardization and the amount of training that police were getting. There were also other concerning things going on socially in our country that made the Supreme Court and made people want to see more control and to have a better police force. Obviously with the civil rights, and then in the 70s, a rise in addiction. But also in the 70s, you start to see attempts for the first evidence-based practices. That's when those start to actually come into play. You start seeing research being done on crime and on crime control, and you actually see training of the police. Many of the programs of criminal justice when we're talking about colleges and universities and certifications, started around that time. There was now evidence to see, and people wanted people going into the force wanted to be better informed and wanted to be more knowledgeable about what they were doing and how it was impacting communities, and vice versa. We wanted, us as the community wanted to see that from our police as well. So we're starting to really get into this full swing. We're starting to really get closer, and we're starting to what we have today within policing, which is a much bigger focus on evidence-based practices and research and what works. As obviously through the 90s and through the early 2000s, things again change. When you're looking at the 90s, you still see unrest. You see the beating of Rodney King, which resulted in a massive amount of change within the policing system at large in the United States. And then in the early 2000s, you also see a greater shift into more intelligence-led policing after 9/11. So all of these decades have a little bit more influence. They kind of have all left their mark on, especially since the 1960s forward, on how we see policing and understand policing today. So make sure you understand that and you have a good grasp on what exactly each impact generations previously had on policing as we see it today. A little bit more on chapter 5, because we kind of touch on it. You start to learn and understand the hierarchy of policing as it is today through chapter 4, but you really get into the nitty-gritty of it in chapter 5. Chapter 5 is where we start looking at actual the hierarchical I hate that word, I'm sorry, but the hierarchy within the police organization. You learn about the how people actually move through the ranks. It's somewhat similar to the military in that time in rank system, but that your time within service, as you gather more time and you gather more experience, you're more likely to be able to move up, and you have to stay in that position. You can't just jump around. And part of that is due to police unions making sure that everything is equitable for those who are in the police system, who are in the police organization, but it's also about making sure that you have the experience necessary to be in the position that you're hoping to be in. So focus somewhat on your reading within the actual organization of the police, but the bigger thing that I want you guys to focus on is the role of police. When we think of police, and truthfully, when we're actually looking at police as a structure, there are really 3 functions that police have. We have enforcing the law, investigations, and patrol. Obviously, patrol is closely linked to the kind of watchman standards that you go over in chapter 4, but patrol is really more than that. It's really about deterring crime. It's about being available for rapid response, reaction, right? It's to maintain order. It's to aid people who are in need, and it's to promote safety of communities. So when you think about this function, what 2/3 of any police force actually takes up of, there is such a huge focus on patrol. I want you to think about what that is actually done to the perception of how we as a society perceive police, and what if they are actually fulfilling that function within our society today. It's within these roles you get very, very different types of police and types of patrolmen and archetypes. So what does that really say about our society, and what does it say about policing at large? The last bit of chapter 5 focuses on some different types of policing. You have community-oriented policing, problem-oriented policing, and intelligence-led policing. Definitely take some time to connect those decades that we talked about in chapter 4 to those policing changes that we've seen and how that has affected policing today. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm about to run out of time on my timer, and I hope you guys have a great night.